Hey everybody, this is Dr. Maples. Welcome back to our Social Change in Appalachia lecture series. So this two-part lecture today is going to do two things. The first lecture is going to explore this idea of social change. We're going to look at the definition of the term. We're also going to learn some sort of related terminology that we need to also start thinking about categorizing social change. Next, we're going to look at some theoretical perspectives to help us really understand what we're looking at and to predict social change in the future. We got a lot to do today, and we got a lot of hills to run up because you had to give me at least one Stranger Things pun, right, with this t-shirt? No? Moving on? Okay, let's get started. Social change seems kind of like an obvious concept, right? It means something's changing in our society. And that's actually kind of true. As a working definition, we're going to think about how social change refers to alterations that are found in the order of our society, basically how things work. And in this definition, we're going to find change in three areas: social institutions, social behaviors, and/or social interactions. Now, I realize everyone watching this series is not a sociologist, so I do want to give you some background and examples of, first off, social change, but these three examples in practice. Let's look at that. Now, when we're talking about institutions, behaviors, and interactions, we can think about them as follows. First off, let's think about laws. Laws change all the time. Laws could change to provide equal access to education. That's actually an example of a social institution changing. For those of you who don't know, social institutions include things like our family, our economy and political system, our education and religious system, and more. This is all about like the backbone of how our society functions. And so if we create laws that change one of these institutions, that's a big deal. We could also think too about maybe the change in the definition of family over time as being an example of, again, laws changing social institutions. Social institutions are really big, and you'll actually come to find out that they include all of this other stuff like behaviors and interactions. But they're important because they really give a sense of normality and form to how our society functions. Therefore, if a social institution changes, that's a big deal. I mean, the legalization of same-sex marriage was a really big change because it suddenly made a marriage, an act that had previously only been available to males and females getting married, is now available to everyone in the United States. So this was a really big change. So we can think about changes to the social institution as a really big deal. We can then start going a little smaller than that, maybe things that are a little less noticeable, such as a change in behaviors. I have noticed in my time as a professor, 10 years now, hard to believe, I don't know, I used to have hair when I started this job. Anyways, in the 10 years that I have been a professor, I have seen the process of the internet becoming normal. I have seen email becoming normal. I have seen the normalcy of using a phone go away. I don't even receive phone calls on my phone anymore. And even the movement towards texts becoming a normalized form of basically communication. This is where we see a social behavior has changed, becoming more normal over time. It's perfectly normal for people to text symbols and it have meaning. Social behaviors are included in social institutions. Social institutions teach us how we can behave. These behaviors change over time, and so they can actually even correlate with changes in social institutions. For example, in education, it's kind of becoming more and more normal for the emails from my students to become more like texts. We're also seeing more students and professors working on like programs like Discord, where they can communicate more easily and more in the moment rather than sending like these very formal emails or like coming by my office. Nonetheless, behavior is a great example of social change. So now we've seen some examples of that. Let's also talk about social interactions. Social interactions are how we introduce and interact with each other's both as individuals, but even as groups of people. And let me give you an example from the education system again here. We're recently starting to see in some situation colleges are now recognizing student athletes as basically people who are in some small way sort of an employee of the university. Video games have been using the likenesses, names, images, and more of college athletes for free for several years. And the NCAA basically banned the ability of athletes to make money off of that. Well, that's actually now changed. So there are situations where athletes are able to make money off their likenesses while they're a college athlete. This is huge because it's changing how people are interacting with college athletes, how colleges are interacting with their own athletes, and even how athletes are interacting with their teammates, other places, and so forth. So we've seen a change in social interactions. Again, we can kind of move down the system here. Social institution is the big backbone of our society. That includes social behaviors because that's where we learn them. Social behaviors include how we interact with other people, social interactions. So we can see how these three things are all examples of social change and places that we might want to start thinking about watching for social change to occur. And by the way, these three areas most definitely overlap. So I do want to give you some examples of social change, and I also want to revisit our categories thus far, thinking about institution change, behavior change, and interaction change. Let's start with the Civil Rights Movement. Civil Rights Movement, 1964, establishes that we have a human right to be treated fairly and equally as others. This actually builds on a massive social institutional change in 1954. That's Brown v. Board of Education, where the Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, reverses an earlier court decision legalizing segregation from the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, which was 1896, as I recall, and says that segregation is, quote, harmful to the individual and that we can't do it. It should be illegal, and it's also not moral, ethical, or anything like that. So we cannot separate students largely because of their race. We have to give people equal access to things. This was huge because it changed how a social institution functioned. It's a great example of social change. How about the Industrial Revolution? The Industrial Revolution changes how we behave at work. You know, prior to the Industrial Revolution, we basically on a daily basis were sustenance farmers who did some basic trades, maybe some work for wage, to get the things that we needed to survive. With the Industrial Revolution, they needed people to be in the factories 24 hours a day. So they had people coming in on a time clock, which wasn't really a thing back then. And you had to be there at a set time or you got penalized, but you were given a wage for your time of working. That was a whole revolutionary idea that changed how we as humans behave. For example, it created us into consumers. Rather than knowing the people that make our things, we ended up just buying them from strangers. I mean, there was a day that all the sweaters and hats and t-shirts that I have would have been made by people I know. Today, I buy them from a strange corporation who purchased them for very cheap from people who made them in other places, and will never the two meet. So these are big changes in our behaviors. Let's think about our interactions with COVID, however. COVID radically changed how we interact with other people. It first off changed to the fact that it changed our behaviors in the sense that many people, including myself, feel comfortable wearing a mask in public now, versus I maybe wouldn't have felt comfortable with that before, even though other cultures regularly do that. But secondly, it changed how we interacted with other people. I've noticed that it has changed how close I stand to other people, also arguably a behavior as well as part of my interactions with others. I'm also maybe thoughtful about when people are wearing masks. I maybe step further back from them if I don't have one on, someone who's vaccinated. So these are all examples of how we change our interactions. Same thing goes for cellular devices and computers. These have radically changed how things work. There was back in the day, we had to call people on the phone and maybe they're home and maybe they're not. Now our interactions can be entirely online. They can be email oriented and all sorts of other things. So our interactions have changed. You know, it's interesting because we can note a couple of things. First off, some of these feel very abrupt. Others are very slow burns. The Industrial Revolution didn't happen overnight, nor did the American Revolution. COVID kind of felt like it did, you know, it was there. And then like 2 weeks later, it was in the United States and things were closing. And all of a sudden we're going into a 2-year lockdown. I mean, there was just not a lot of warning time on that. Wars, same thing. They kind of just happen overnight. There's no set time period on these two. They kind of happen and they go until they're sort of run their course. You can note too how each of them kind of creates change. You know, COVID's changed how we behave. The Civil Rights Movement changed how people were treated. The Industrial Revolution changed how people worked. These are all great examples of change creating change. What we want to do here is think about, too, how do we understand what generates these changes? We want to think about that bigger picture of, you know, we see a change clearly occurred, but what explains how it happened? So this is where we can begin this process of starting to categorize change as we see it. Now, we'll get some useful codes that we can use a little later in our lectures, but I want to start first by thinking about how we can categorize change. And these are all simple ways that you can approach a change and understand to some degree what's going on. For example, first one's an easy one. Is it a planned change or an unplanned change? You know, revolutions, they have a little bit of planning to them. they've also got some sort of kind of rash, just they happen situations. What about the changing of a law? Well, there's some planning behind that. Maybe the change into a social institution, like the creation of student loans. There's some planning that goes behind that. And then there's things like earthquakes and COVID that just suddenly happen and we have to react to them. So is a change planned or unplanned? Sometimes it can be hard to tell the two. Sometimes there can even be elements of both. So is it planned or unplanned? We can also think too if it's an endogenous change or an exogenous change. And I have trouble saying those words because I'm from Appalachia. So I'm going to use internal and external. Is it something, a change that happens from within our society, such as maybe a conflict over a resource or disagreements over how our society should be run? Or is it from external, outside our in society? This can be wars in other places, such as the war in Ukraine being a good example. It's having social changes here on the United States with shortages in food and so forth. Let's think too about these changes being evolutionary. They sort of slowly define and change things, or are they revolutionary? They're a radical thing that changes right now. Evolutionary is a term that's kind of loaded, so I want to back away from the anthropological, biological definition. And what I mean here is just things slowly change over time. I'm not referring to evolution, the idea of evolution or anything like that. But within evolution could be something like how our communication has changed. There was a time where we wrote letters, then we sent telegraphs, then we sent phone calls because everybody had a phone all of a sudden. And we didn't have to go and put in a quarter at the machine to use the phone. And then everybody had cell phones, so we could just call people, and then we could text them, and then we could send emojis and memes and so forth. These are all kind of example of evolution in technology over time. Revolutionary are when things get overthrown very quickly. The January 6th insurrection is a great example of an attempted revolution there. We can also think too about, again, the French Revolution, American Revolution, but also even things like sort of industrial revolutions that happen. They change things radically. They change them now. They sort of institute new ideas, some more aggressive than other, but they happen very quickly. And whereas things change slowly in evolutionary processes, revolutions typically are very quick. I mean, the French Revolution was cover to cover in a decade. The American Revolution was less than that, technically. So these things can happen really, really quickly. I want to add some more ideas to that too. We could think about social movements versus social revolutions. Social movements kind of go back to this sort of evolutionary process of where a list of things occur over time that change conditions. The Civil Rights Act would be a great example of that. I mean, that links back as far as the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, and even before that, most certainly the history of slavery in the United States. Whereas we can think with social revolution, again, things like the January 6th protests, the Stop Steal, Save America, Change Things Now approach, are very much like a group of people have come together and decided to change things. The social movement is something that gathers over time and still gathers energy, whereas a social revolution can kind of be a group of people coming together a little more quickly. One thing that I think is useful to think about with change too is that it replaces old ideas. We had pagers. Did you know what pagers are? They are these little boxes that attach to basically your waist, and people could send you their number. It was like a weird texting thing where like basically their phone number would pop up on your pager, and it would let you know that you need to get to a phone to call them. They were ideas that we replaced soon with cellular phones. We also want to think too about how we react to change. And this is a little bit too about the social movement and social revolution. But we can think about how people may conform to social changes, or they may also resist them. Depending on our lived experiences, we may have very different decisions. Changes to the definition of the family, the legalization of same-sex marriage was a great example of that. I am a big supporter of it. A lot of my family back home was not. This was a thing that we were coming from different places and different lived experiences. We all make our decisions about how we will interact with social change. That's like a thing that we have to acknowledge how our society is going to necessarily deal with social change. So these are all categories that we can use to think about social change. And in doing so, it lets us break things down a little bit. Now, these all overlap again, and they may not be exclusive categories. See, these are sort of ideal types, as Max Weber would call them, because they're sort of perfect cases. And there's probably lots of in-betweens that you would want to tease out. But this is an exercise that helps us at least to begin thinking about breaking down what's happening when we see a social change occur. So with these factors of change, or categories of change, as I like to call them for shorthand, we have a couple of really great examples to help us see what's going on. First one is demographic change. This could be changes in how a populace looks in terms of its age or sex, its understanding of gender, its racial composition. This could also be people moving from one place to another. Good example of this actually could be my dissertation research, where I explored the idea of U.S. ethnic niches post-Katrina in New Orleans. There, after the hurricane, we saw that people who were moving from Mexico and migrating to the United States were establishing new businesses and things like construction. And so the big question was, after that, what's going to happen? Are they going to stay there, or are they going to move to other places? Well, it was really interesting because they actually stayed in that area and created different kinds of ethnic niches, like restaurants, for examples. We can also think about technology. The invention of the cell phone is so amazing. They used to be these huge brick things that you threw in the back of your convertible back in the Miami Vice days. Now they get smaller and smaller and smaller, that it's going to be like hard to keep up with them at some point. They also do more and more and more. I mean, they've gone from being like a device that could basically send simple texts to now they're basically computers. So it's really amazing to see how we're using them. Even little changes too, like the fact that everybody's got a camera now, which is actually a very valuable thing in being able to document rights and wrongs in our society. We can think about cultural change. These can be changes in our norms, especially our behaviors, what we think is normal or acceptable. I remember a time when Dungeons and Dragons was considered very immoral and wrong, and people would give me weird looks in the 80s because I played Dungeons and Dragons. And now I love you, Gen Z, because you've made it not only famous, but helped everyone around the world understand that it's a really fun activity. So if you like to play D&D, let me know in the comments below. With political change, anytime we have new people move into power or power rise and fall, we see these changes. But with political stuff, we want to think about power. Power is the ability to do things. That relates to authority as well, a term that we'll use later. Authority is the idea that we can force people to do other stuff that they don't necessarily want to do. You compel them to do that. Power and authority are important because they're part of politics. And these are things that we can use to create social change or actively resist it. Same goes for economic. This is an important category because if the economy changes, it can cause people to move away, a demographic transition. It can cause people to move into an area because of opportunities, also a demographic transition. Education is another great example of this too. Educational change could include the information that we give to people over time. It could be the way that we give information. So this is a new way of offering courses, is online. Kind of goes back to what we were doing in the 70s with telecourses, where you did correspondence and you mailed the stuff in, they would grade it and mail it back to you. Very cost inefficient, but you could do college courses very much that way back then. So educational changes are another big one. And now one that's not often listed as a factor of change, but that I think is important, is environment. I list environment here because when we look at the history of social change in Appalachia, so much of it relates to the environment. We see that often we are sort of left holding the bag, so to speak, for toxins and problems that are created from extraction and not getting the resources from that extraction, or not even getting to use the actual stuff that we've extracted. These are all examples of factors of change. These are not isolated categories. They're sort of ideal types, but they all overlap, and be comfortable letting them overlap. You just think about them as being like more than one example. In fact, you might even want to explore how like demographic and technological stuff kind of matter in this particular case study. But we can think about how all of these work together. I can't tell you enough. Print this, take a picture of it, save it on your phone, whatever you need to do to keep up with this list. We're going to keep coming back to it time after time after time. You're going to see examples in my lectures, and then eventually you're going to have the chance to start doing this on your own. So be prepared for that moment. I want to close this lecture with the basics of the characteristics of change. And I want to point out that these kind of overlap with some things we've already talked about, but I want to point out that change shares some common things. First off, it's a shared experience. It's not something that I just experience as an individual. It's all of us experience it together. Second, it's universal in the sense that change will always happen. We can't escape the idea that change will happen. It's going to occur in some form. So it's not something that can just not occur. Even if you try your hardest to make things not change, it will eventually. The dam will eventually burst. Third, it's an ongoing process. It's not something that just happens and stops. It typically is something that takes years to generations to decades to centuries and so forth. It's also not a moral judgment. We're not making judgments about people being ahead, behind. In fact, we're even going to question that idea of sort of linear evolutionary thought in social change in our next lecture. But we're not sort of trying to say people are at a good or bad spot, or that change is even a good thing, because sometimes change is a bad thing. It doesn't always go the way that it should. It's temporal too, in the sense that change requires time, and we don't know what kind of time that's going to be and how even that time is going to be understood or measured. It could be something that's going to be the story of eons. It could be something that's the story of a matter of minutes. Even something like the September 11th attack would be an example that changed the entire U.S. world relationship within 24 hours. And it was something that we maybe won't even understand the temporal nature of it for many generations. We have to understand, too, that change, again, has no time. We don't understand how long it's going to go, how fast it's going to go. It just takes its own speed. We can't necessarily predict it. We can attempt to predict it based on what we know. We can't assume that history repeats itself. That phrase is pretty flawed, and we'll talk more about that in our next lecture. But we can't truly predict change. We can try to, but we can't. It is sequential in some sense that we can understand a list of things happens to create change. Those categories on the previous page are a great example of that. We can understand how those categories relate to each other to predict and understand changes that are occurring. It's also the result of interactions. As we interact with other people, groups interact, and so forth. These are the ways that we slowly create social change, whether it's something really fast, like a social revolution, or something really slow, like a social movement. It doesn't have a scale other than it's more than an individual. It can be a really big deal, or it could be really small. I think of like the Hormel union strikes in the 80s as a great example of something that created a lot of interesting changes. But it's also not something that's like very big, or even necessarily something that you know about. Change can be peaceful. It can be violent. It can be violent in the sense of social revolutions or the January 6th insurrection, or it can be peaceful, where we see over time conversations about a topic simply create social change without violence. And it also may replace old ideas, but change can also entrench old ideas. And this is where, again, we can think about with social movements and social revolutions being examples of that. They can take ideas that society wants to radically change, or it can simply keep them as they are and say, nope, this is how it has to be over time. Kind of imparting too, we can think about how social institutions don't like to change. Well, that's a great example of entrenching those old ideas. And when they break, sometimes they just absolutely smash. That is it for now. So we've finished the first lecture. We've defined social change. We've got some categories of social change. We have some ways that we can code social change. That means that we can categorize it using our factors of change. We've got some ways that we can break down change. Now what I want to do is go back to the macro ideas and think about some theoretical perspectives that will help us understand social change. That comes up in the next lecture. I'll see you there.